We are living in a crisis, not merely a political or economic, but one could even say a spiritual crisis. That crisis is a crisis of meaning. The question that you all may have at this point is whether we have the resources to identify this crisis and the capacity to understand what exactly is happening to us. We certainly do. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Popular Philosophy. And in this episode, we will be continuing the theme of postmodernity with the figure Jean-François Lyotard. So, these stories that once gave our world coherence, the stories of progress, reason, and liberation, now may have begun to feel hollow. So what happens when those stories begin to crumble? What happens when the great narratives that once united civilizations lose their power to convince? Lyotard would call this precise condition the postmodern condition. Lyotard was born in 1924 in the aftermath of the First World War. He belonged to a generation haunted by the wreckage of Enlightenment optimism, figures that we've already covered, but we will continue to cover in the future, such as Adorno and Horkheimer, were dealing with this precise issue. Before becoming a philosopher, Lyotard was a teacher and a Marxist activist, convinced that reason and revolution could potentially redeem the world. But history, that old deceiver, would quickly disabuse him of that faith. By the 1970s, Lyotard realized that the grand promises of modernity, again, promises of reason, of progress, of science, were beginning to fail to hold society together. He began to ask, what happens to humanity when it can no longer believe in its own story? So what happens when this narrative begins to end? And this leads us to part two, the end of grand narratives. In 1979, Lyotard published his text, The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge. In it, Lyotard declared that modernity was built upon grand narratives. These are sweeping stories that justified knowledge, power, and a direction for history. And we've already seen some of the exemplary figures of that narrative, figures such as Hegel, Marx, and perhaps some could say even Kant. These narratives of progress, enlightenment, and emancipation once gave us faith in history's arc, but Lyotard saw that faith faltering. The world was fragmenting into countless smaller stories, or what one could call language games. Lyotard wrote, knowledge in the form of an informational commodity is already and will be the principal force of production. Lyotard saw the coming age of data, the age that we currently live in, a world where information becomes currency and truth becomes performance. For Lyotard, postmodernity wasn't a rebellion against reason. It was a moment when reason itself became suspect, when humanity discovered that rational systems might just be another form of storytelling. And this idea of storytelling and narratives is not entirely new, as Friedrich Nietzsche in The Twilight of Idols was discussing this very problem. For Lyotard, he warned that what we were seeing was a new face of the crisis, a crisis not of ignorance, but of too much knowledge. So part three, living after these grand narratives have crumbled. Lyotard was no nihilist. He did not call for despair or indifference. Just as many of the figures that we've already discussed in this postmodern series also did not advocate for a form of despair. Rather, Lyotard would ask, how do we live after the death of grand narratives? His answer? We must learn to listen. We must learn to listen to the small, to the local, to the fragile voices that resist being absorbed into total systems. And again, this may sound familiar to you if you all have engaged with Adorno in negative dialectics, or at least maybe this is my own idiosyncrasy and a similarity that I've discovered. So, with this being said, this brings us to Lyotard's concept of the differend, or the differend. The conflict between two worlds of meaning that cannot be judged by the same rule. For a moment, I would like for you to humor me, and we will return to the figure of Derrida, because I believe that there's some continuity here that can explain what exactly Lyotard is getting at. Derrida's difference, or difference, described how meaning never stands still. Words mean what they do only through their differences from others, and those meanings are always deferred, never complete. There is no final or fixed center of truth, only an endless play of signs. Lyotard takes this insight into the realm of justice with his concept of differend, which names a conflict between two language worlds that cannot be judged by a single rule. A differend occurs when someone suffers a wrong that cannot be expressed or recognized within the dominant discourse, when there is literally no phrase for their pain. Where Derrida exposes the instability of meaning, Lyotard reveals the ethical stakes of that instability, the silencing of voices that language itself cannot yet hear. The postmodern world, as Lyotard would believe, therefore demands humility, a recognition that meaning is plural, that truth is relational, that justice begins with the refusal to silence what cannot be translated. We are still living in Lyotard's crisis, but perhaps he would tell us that crisis is not catastrophe. It is a moment when something ends and something else new begins. The end of grand narratives is not the end of meaning, but perhaps it is an invitation to create meaning. Lyotard died in 1998 quietly, but his vision lingers in every philosophical debate about knowledge, technology, and power. He reminds us that the death of old stories does not mean silence. It means the beginning of a new course, one we can compose. Because even in crisis, thought endures. And through thought, humanity still speaks. Thank you all for joining me for another episode of Popular Philosophy in this series of Postmodernity. If you found this episode to be helpful or learned something, please like, comment, and subscribe for future content. I look forward to bringing you all another episode very shortly.